and welcome to the Bronx StreamYard's Farm to Table series, where we're kicking off the new year with a two-part session on sorghum. My name is Maya, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a chef, cook, urban farmer, and educator who was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, but I've called Brooklyn, New York my home for the past 12 or so years. I'm the lead collaborator / founder of Deep Roots, which is a culinary and agricultural curriculum project that uplifts Black and Indigenous foodways designed for Black and Indigenous people of color, educators, and learners. We're building a platform of learning resources that affirm BIPOC culinary and agricultural stories through cooking classes, learning materials, and media. If you want to learn more about us, you can find us at deeproots.org. Today, we'll be working with the beautifully dynamic plant sorghum and the glaze or barbecue sauce we're making for some roasted chicken. Later in the workshop, we'll learn a bit more about sorghum, but first we're going to focus on how to break down a chicken and then get into making the glaze. So here we are butchering a full chicken. And what I'm pointing out is that you want to begin by going for the joints. So that's where you want your knife to cut through. You're not trying to cut through bone. You're trying to find the part cartilage and points of connection so that your knife is just going through. So you're feeling for gaps in the skin, and then feeling for joints, and then just using your knife to cut through that cartilage, which if you have a sharp knife, and you want to be sure to have a sharp knife so that you're being safe, because a sharp knife is always more safer than a dull knife. You're just going to cut right through that. And we're starting by cutting off the quarters, which are the legs and the thighs. So starting off that. So we're going to cut off the quarters here to get that removed. And again, you're just cutting through that skin, looking for the cartilage or the joints, and then just pulling your knife through to separate it from the back. Particularly the quarters, you're going to be, the main point of separation is going to be from the back of the bird. And then next you can, go to start cutting the wings off. And again, you're looking for joints. You're looking for soft points. You don't want to cut through bone. And here you're going to take a little bit of the breast for the drumstick of the wing and just cutting through like so. And then we're going to move on to separating the breast meat from the breastbone around the wishbone, known to some folks. And you're just going to take a moment to feel where the bones are and feel where the meat is, so you can begin to make an incision as close to getting the meat separated from the breast meat separated from that breastbone, and getting out the tender as well. So you're just cutting that off and then cutting it all the way down until you get to the bottom of the breastbone. And you can also see here I'm showing a little bit of that tenderloin cut, and then taking as much skin with it as you want. And of course, you can break down this breast piece into more strips if you want to. And then you're just going to do the same thing with the other side, because the breastbone is almost shaped like a Y, and you're separating the breast meat sits on opposite sides of that Y, and you're just separating it. And here with the bone, you can freeze it if you want to save it for cooking with later to flavor soups. You can boil it immediately or roast it and then boil it to make a really flavorful stock. But definitely you don't have to immediately throw it in the trash. You can definitely save it for other purposes, to add a lot of flavor and depth with the fat and muscle that's in that part of the meat. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to get into making some of the ingredients for the sauce. So to make the sauce, we're going to need some diced onions, apple cider vinegar, ketchup, tomato paste, sorghum syrup. And we're going to get all those ingredients into a pot to simmer while the chicken is roasting in the oven. So off screen, here we have some chicken that's already roasting in the oven, with the spices, seasoned with the spices. But right now, This portion, we're just going to cut up the onions into a small dice. So you just cut the onions by flipping them over half, because whenever you have a round object like an onion or any other kind of root vegetable, tomatoes, or like big slicing tomatoes, it can be easier to cut the vegetable into a half so that you have better control over more stability as you're making your precise knife cuts. So here I just cut the onion in half, and then I'm taking off the top of the onion, not the root or bottom of it, just so I can peel off the skin and get off some of those thick, tough layers of skin that won't really break down for the length of time that we're going to be cooking it. So what I'm doing here is we're going to make knife cuts that are horizontal to the layers of the onion, or that kind of front part of the onion. And then you're going to turn it and make some vertical cuts down against those horizontal cuts that you made. And this is going to make your knife cuts more uniform. Of course, they don't have to be perfect. We're just trying to get a small uniform dice that will cook down and add lots of flavor to our sauce. So we're just going to make those vertical cuts like so. And then you're going to make a cut across on the top that is going to finish your dice and have them all break down into small pieces. And so yeah, then you can set that aside, and we're going to saute these in our pot that's going to have our other sauce ingredients. So here in the skillet, I'm just adding some olive oil, or you can use canola oil. I think I'm using canola oil here. Canola oil into the skillet, adding the onions, having them on like medium low heat so that they're just getting browned a bit. Add some salt and pepper, or you can use the spice blend that's included with the recipe. And the next thing we're going to do is start to measure out the liquids that are going to go into the sauce. All right, so the first step to making our sorghum barbecue sauce or glaze, we're going to be adding in some Worcestershire sauce. If you're vegetarian or vegan, you can skip the Worcestershire sauce because that usually has fish products in it. I think usually anchovies. That adds a lot of depth to it. And then after the apple cider vinegar, we're actually adding in a cup of the ketchup. So a cup of the ketchup is going to go in there, get that measured out. And then we're also going to add in a tablespoon of tomato paste. You can add that to the sauce mix, or here you can add that tablespoon into the onions as they're cooking. So that's what I'm pointing out here, is that the tomato paste is cooking in there with the onions and all that good stuff. And then next, you're going to add in the sorghum syrup to the mix of liquids. And we're adding in about a half a cup of that. If you don't have sorghum syrup, you can also use molasses or brown sugar, any really rich sweetener substitute. You could also try honey. I haven't tried that yet, but that might kind of add a different flavor profile to this dish. And then last, you're just going to combine all this together, give it a stir. And once the onions become a little translucent and tender, are no longer like super opaque, you can add in the sauce and start to have it cook and simmer. You want to bring it to a bit of a boil and then allow it to simmer for about like 15 or so minutes, because it's going to cook and thicken when you baste the sauce with the bird as well. So yeah, just being mindful of all of that. Also in the sauce, you can season it a bit more with the cayenne pepper, the salt, black pepper, garlic clove, either garlic cloves that you've diced or granulated garlic. You can add that to the sauce mix in the measuring cup or bowl that you're using, or you can season the onions with those spices so that they bloom a little bit more before you're adding that in. So here I'm showing some of the pre-measured spices that include the teaspoon of black pepper, teaspoon of kosher salt, the quarter teaspoon of cayenne pepper, which you can adjust according to your heat level tolerance, and the granulated garlic, which we're gonna get into the pan with the onion and is also on our chicken. So here I'm just noting that we're adding in that tablespoon of tomato paste to the onion pan so that it can get browned, caramelize a little bit, and start to break down somewhat so that it doesn't taste like it's straight out of the can. And also just adds more, again, trying to add layers of depth of flavor to this dish. And I'm just showing the live audience what it looks like inside the pan. So we're going to let that cook a little bit. And then once it's the tomato paste is browned somewhat, we're going to add in the sauce. And I'm checking on our roasted chicken that's in the oven. Once the onions are a little bit more caramelized and tender, not so much super caramelized, but just more tender, we're going to add in that the sorghum sauce mix. And here I'm just turning the chicken around. It's been baking in the oven for a little bit, so that we have it ready for our live audience to taste. So I'm just giving those pieces a little turn midway through cooking. And then I'm going to pop those back in for a couple more minutes while they finish cooking and our sauce cooks. And we don't have to cook them like done because you're going to add on the sauce, but just wanted to be extra precautious here. So I'm cooking them just a little longer than I normally would. But yeah. And then we're going to transition into talking a little bit about sorghum on the slides. Here I'm just showing that the onions and tomato paste are about ready, and I'm adding in the sorghum sauce mix so that can get boiling and then simmer while we talk and go into the slides. All right, so while the sauce is cooking, we are going to get to know sorghum a little bit more, get into a little bit of the history of this Black indigenous crop, go a little bit into the origins, botany, and some of its transformations. So, sorghum is a grass that is indigenous to the eastern regions of Africa, specifically Sudan, Chad, and Niger, regions of Central and East African savannas. And it's been in cultivation for over at least 3,000 years, at least 3,000 years, at least 5,000, at least 3 to 5,000 years. It's a little different. Researchers have different ranges as to which they think it was first cultivated by indigenous folks in Sudan, Chad, and Niger. So yeah, that's like a little bit of the origins of the crop. And like other grasses, it's very drought tolerant. It's very resilient grass. Produces really abundant plumes that can be turned into grains and stuff. And what we'll get a little bit more into in a second. Then going into the botany, like I mentioned, it's in the grass family along with other grains like corn, millet, rice. And again, it's a drought-tolerant plant that thrives in mild tropical climates and grows really well in poor soils. And when we say poor soil, we're speaking of soils that lack nutrients and texture quality. So even if it's a heavy clay soil, if it's a sandy soil, if it's a soil that maybe has high salinity or a lot of salt in it, sorghum is going to find a way to grow and thrive and do well. And the heads of the grain have a lot of micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. And it also produces, some varieties can produce juice that can cooked into a syrup like the one that we're using in this evening's recipe. Very similar to sugar canes. So the canes of sorghum stalks, they grow at least 5 or 6 feet tall, and each of those stalks can be pressed to produce a green juice that can be slowly cooked into the deep, rich sorghum syrup, molasses of sorts that we're seeing in today's recipe. Lastly, there are so many transformations that sorghum can have. And saying transformations instead of ways to cook it, because there's so many ways that sorghum transforms into other ways of existing, including being a whole grain that you can cook with in the culinary sense. So thinking about the culinary uses of sorghum, it's a gluten-free whole grain that can be in like you would millet or quinoa or rice. And it can also be used as a flour to make muffins, cakes, and snacks, like the muffins that we're making in the second part of this series around sorghum. And like I mentioned, it can also be pressed into a really mineral-rich juice or syrup for both sauces, like the one we're making in this session, as well as herbal medicine, and any other kinds of things you might want to dream or envision for using a plant like this. And then it can also be used as a plant dye. So the seeds, both the seeds, I believe, as well as the leaves of the plant, which sometimes have little bits of red in there, can be made into dyes for yarns and other fibers. So it's a really versatile crop to grow. It's a very abundant crop. It has very big yields for very little space because the heads of the sorghum plant are very, very generous in their offerings.
If you are cooking at home or you're going to use this recipe, we'd love to see a picture. So feel free to email us. Email us at the address that sent you the Zoom link, and we'd love to get your picture. Thanks so much for coming.